Hey there poetry pals, welcome back to another video. My name's Josie Alford. I just published my debut poetry collection and I'm doing a Q&A where I ask my followers to ask me questions about the publishing process, about the book, and I'm going to answer them for you now. Let's go. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. This is my debut poetry collection. It's called Faulty Manufacturing. It's published by Verve Poetry Press, and it is a whole collection about the time when my dad died and how I dealt with that grief and how our relationship was complicated and how that shaped the grieving process. But before we go any further, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. The engagement really helps small creators like me get found. You can buy my book by going to the link in the description. That's definitely one of the best ways you can help me. And you can support me with your money in other ways by joining me on Patreon or buying me a coffee. If you don't have the money to spend, no bother. You can follow me on social media at Josie Alford Poet on all of the things. And just a reminder, interacting with this video, commenting, sharing, doing all of that stuff helps creators like me get found. And I make a teeny weeny bit of money off the adverts here. So go ahead and do all the clicks and it really helps me out. So the first question is, where does the title come from? And to be honest, no one actually asked me this. I just want to tell you where the title came from. Faulty Manufacturing is the title of one of the poems in there, which is a common thing to do, is name your collection after one of the poems. And I think it works as well because that poem is the emotional centre of the collection. The reason I say emotional centre is because all of my thoughts and all of my poems are the way they are because of this one undeniable fact, which is there was domestic violence in the relationship with my dad, and Faulty Manufacturing is the only poem that deals with that. So that being the title poem made sense to me. But Faulty Manufacturing is a phrase that has followed my poetry for a long time. I actually used to have a blog, which now I'm thinking about this before I release this video, I need to go and make sure that that blog doesn't exist anymore, because it's early poems that were also terrible. But yeah, it's a phrase that meant a lot to me. It was the name of my first blog where I used to share my poems online. And the reason it's a phrase that means a lot to me is because it is actually a Jason Mraz lyric. Now, my lecturer at uni told me that I should never tell anyone that it comes from a Jason Mraz lyric. I shouldn't admit to being influenced by pop culture, but I think that that is bollocks. In the album Details in the Fabric, there is a song called Details in the Fabric, and the running metaphor is that, like, life is a tapestry, and sometimes it is beautiful and sometimes it isn't. And sometimes things go wrong. And then there's this lyric that says, if you're shocked, it's just the fault of faulty manufacturing. There's two main meanings that I take from the faulty manufacturing. Number one is that idea of generational trauma, but also the fact of that children of alcoholics are more likely to grow up to be alcoholics themselves. And so there's this idea of like inherited trauma, inherited brokenness, and that sort of like faulty manufacturing, like that idea that maybe I was made wrong, or maybe my dad was made wrong, or something like that. But then also the other sort of meaning I have with faulty manufacturing is the idea of memory, right? And how trauma can like corrupt your memories. You can not remember things, or you can remember them wrongly, incorrectly. And something that happens a lot when people die as well is there's this instinct to want to speak well of them and not wanting to speak ill of the dead. And I remember being particularly frustrated about that with Dad because he was not great. So, you know, what can I want to remember all of the things, not just all of the good things. And so that idea of how you can like corrupt your own memory and choose to remember in a different way. So that's where Faulty Manufacturing, the title, comes from. How long did the process take? My dad died in December 2017, and I wrote the first poem about my feelings about that 6 days after he died. So from the first poem being written to the publication date was 5 years and 3 months, which in the grand scheme of things is actually quite a long time for a poetry collection. But it is worth saying that during that time I was also building up my writing as well as my poetry career, so it took me a little while to be ready to be published. I submitted my poetry collection, I started submitting it in 2020. Yes, I remember. The whole lockdown thing gave me enough time to finish my poetry collection and start sending it out. I got rejected quite a few times, and then I was eventually accepted in 2021, spring 2021, but Verve had accepted so many people that I wasn't part of the 2022 publishing round. Instead, I got published in 2023. So that's how long the whole process took me. I would say the writing took me, I wrote the vast majority of it within a year. So by the end of 2018, most of the collection had been written, but actually the last poem to be written that ended up being part of the collection was written in December 2022. So yeah, I guess in theory it took me 4 years to write it. So there you go. I think it's important to say that I am glad it took that long. If you'd asked me when I was having written most of the collection by the end of 2018, I probably would have been very impatient and wanted to get it out there and do, you know, get published. I really wanted to I think my goal was to have 2 published books by the time I'm 30. So unless I write a collection and get it published within a month, that isn't going to happen. So yeah, I really wanted to get it out quickly, but now with the time and space, I realised that those 5 years were absolutely needed to get the poems to the right place. Like the finished collection that I had at the end of 2018 still has a lot of the same poems, but they were in vastly different drafts. And I think that those poems needed the 5 years and my writing experience to develop to make them better. But also on a personal level, I needed that time to become a better performer, to also like personally be okay with sharing this work. It's an incredibly personal subject that talks about some very difficult moments in my life, and I needed the time and the space and the therapy to get myself to a place where I would be okay sharing those personal parts of myself with the world. The next question I've got here is, now that you know what you know about publishing a poetry collection, is there anything you would have done differently? I think I would have given myself more patience in the early time to let the poem sit and not have unrealistic expectations about it. I probably would have maybe been a bit more eagle-eyed. There's definitely at least 2 typos in here, which I will correct for the next batch, I promise. The next question I have here is, does a book have to have a strong theme to get published, or is it all about the individual poems? I don't think that a book does need to have a strong theme, but I think that one of the things that publishers, especially traditional publishers, are looking for is something, you know, a USP, a unique selling point. What is the selling point of your book? And I think a strong theme can help with that. For example, mine's about grief and trauma and how that trauma and abuse can shape how you grieve for someone. That unites, it's a strong theme throughout the collection, but it's also a way of me giving my elevator pitch for the book. I don't think it necessarily has to have one, but especially if you're early on in your poetry career, having a strong theme, or at least like something that, you know, brings the collection together, I think that really helps. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a strong theme. It could be a like you write in the same form all the way through, or it could be like one narrative poetry collection. But then, yeah, there are multiple things, but I do think a strong theme can help, but it's not necessarily a must-have. And I think if you're early on in your career, you don't have the name, you don't have the name recognition to be able to sell it just on your name alone. You know, you can't, your first one can't be a selected poems. Like that's not gonna sell as well as being able to say, this is what my poetry collection's about. I hope that makes sense.
Hey, editing Josie here. Just hopping on to add that whilst, you know, having a selling point and all of that is important, the poems being good as well are important too. So in conclusion, my answer is both.
The next question I've got was, what was the easiest part of the journey and what was the hardest? I think the easiest part was designing the cover. I really enjoyed working with my illustrator to design this cover, and there's a question more about that later. So I really enjoyed that bit. And I also, personally, I'm an editor at heart, so I think I found that the editing part a lot easier. The hardest for me was taking myself to the spaces which I found particularly difficult to write in. So I've talked about this in other videos on my channel, but my dad died when I was halfway through my creative writing masters, which involved me writing a lot of poems to a lot of deadlines. Deadlines help motivation, by the way. But yeah, so I was really struggling to I forced myself to write in areas that maybe I shouldn't have done for my own well-being. And I think there were a couple of poems, namely Faulty Manufacturing, and so the title poem of the collection, and December 20th, which is about the day my dad died, that I found particularly difficult to sort of explore and turn into art. And I think that was really hard to do. And I think the other thing again was the patience, and after I had left the masters, continuing that motivation to keep writing and keep going, and like the perseverance of, you know, submitting to multiple publishers and, you know, dealing with rejection and just carrying on. That was very difficult as well. The next question I have was, did you apply to Verve or did they approach you? So Verve do sometimes approach writers. I was not one of them. So I applied. The first time I applied was during their open submissions in 2020, and I got rejected from that, but it was a nice rejection. I've actually got a video on how to handle rejection where I explain what I mean by a nice rejection, but basically there was an encouragement to work on the poems and come back. So that's exactly what I did. I hired an editor, and I came back with a newly edited collection, and I applied again in 2021, and that is when I got accepted. So yeah, just a quick note about Verve is that they have open submission windows. Unfortunately, one has just closed. I was totally planning on getting this video out before then so I could say, oh, there's open submissions, you should apply and be part of the Verve family with me, but I did not do that. So, oops. But yeah, so what I would suggest is if you are looking for, you know, applications and stuff, all of the publishers will have submission guidelines and submission information on their website. And so what you do is you just go in, check out when their next submission date is and pop it in your calendar and use that as a deadline to get your collection together. What did you show them? A sample, synopsis, draft, complete manuscript, etc. And I would say that what I submitted was partway between a draft and a complete manuscript. As I said, I had written most of the poems that were going to end up in the collection by the time I was submitting. There were literally, once I got accepted there were only 2 poems that needed to be written. Like, the ideas for them were there and they had to be in this collection, otherwise they wouldn't belong in any other collection. So I had to write those after being submitted, but it was close enough to a complete manuscript. One of the things that Verve also ask you to do, which is not uncommon between indie publishers, is they wanted me to give a supporting document. So with that, I wrote the sort of synopsis of the poetry collection. It's the thing that ended up, well, it was a draft of what became the blurb. And then I also had to show in this document my favourite poets, my favourite performers, and how I planned to market and sell the book. And the reason for that is because for a lot of, especially indie publishers and publishers who publish spoken word poets, a huge amount of their model is based on the poet selling their own books. My book is in bookshops. I have seen it. It is in bookshops. But because I'm not a relatively that well-known name in the sort of literary scene, I have to sell books myself in order to actually get books sold. So you have to show them how you plan on doing that. So I mentioned, you know, getting gigs and, you know, doing a series of videos about my book online. So this is part of that, you know, I wrote about this in the application. So that's something else that Verve asked for. And it's not uncommon with smaller indie presses. So that's worth bearing in mind. So the next question was, did they help you edit and what did that involve? They didn't help me edit that much, but that was because my book was so finished by the time we sort of started to work together. There were some minor changes, and actually, to be honest, the most of the editing happened with the sort of typesetting, because I'd been used to working on like Word, right? And that's normally always a A4 page, but like the books aren't A4, so how they look on the page will vary because the page is smaller. So there were moments of that where we worked together on that. It was much more of a mutual thing, and not a huge amount of editing happened between getting accepted and publication. So the next question I have here is, as a performer, you can share a poem as soon as you think it's ready. Publishing is much slower. Was that frustrating? Are there any tips on how to use the time well? And so yeah, the process of publishing is a lot slower, and it can be frustrating. But as I said earlier with me talking about how long it took me, I am glad of that time. And so the tips on how to use that time well would be taking time to like marinate with your poems, edit them, send them to people, get feedback, structuring your collection, and actually, like, if you get accepted and you've only written half of your collection, taking the time to write it, but definitely the editing and the constant work to make it better, but also using that time to improve your reading of your poems, go to open mic nights, practice, and also to grow your following and your potential audience. Now, I'm not saying that everyone has to be on social media. In fact, you know, maybe we should all spend less time here. But one of the things that I spent my time doing is building up my online presence that helped me you know, have a greater reach, so that when my book launched, I was able to like sell out my venue, and I've been able to get gigs around the UK now, and part of that is because of my expanded reach online. So those are the things that I would work on while you're waiting for your book to be published. When my poetry collection was released, I felt exposed. There are many poems in this collection that were not published prior. I honestly praised that no one should buy it. Is this feeling normal? And I'm just going to add that there was an element of fear when my collection came out. There was a fear of being judged, especially because I talk quite frankly and often quite comically about grief, and I was worried that people were going to think that I was being disrespectful in some way. So yeah, I think there is certainly a normality in feeling hesitant. However, before I go into my however, I'm going to share, I went to my poetry pals for some advice on this one. And this advice came from Tom Sastry, who is a Bristol-based poet and who has a couple of collections out, and they're both fabulous. So this is what he said. He said, "Conventional publishing is so slow that any reluctance to let the book out ought to be balanced by a healthy dose of, thank God the waiting is over. It is normal to feel both things at once though," which is definitely how I felt. And then he said, "I would urge you to be ready for the silence. If you do a good gig, it's easy for people to come up and congratulate you. If you write a good book, it's frightening to feed back. Imagine saying the wrong thing to an author about their book. So the same nice short comment costs people a lot more with a book, even if they love it. If you do a gig, you might spend a week prepping and get loads of nice comments. You might get the same for a book you have worked on for years, but no one will remember that gig in 5 years' time, whereas you will continue to meet people who respond to the book as long as you are active in poetry." I've certainly found that, you know, having the book has allowed me to do more gigs and like perform to people and get that immediate feedback, but actually getting feedback about the actual book has been relatively quiet. So feel free to let me know in the comments if you already own this book, what you thought of it, if you've read it yet. Tell me if you haven't, I'm interested. I know that I buy books from people and then don't read it for years after, so hey, come back to this video and comment if you've read it and what you thought of it. I would love to hear from it. And I think there's a really good point here, is that conventional publishing is so slow. You know, like mine was delayed by an extra year because my publisher had accepted too many people to publish, you know, the next year. So I ended up being pushed back a year, which I was happy with. But it did take a long time. Whereas like self-publishing, especially with only ebooks as well, it's instant. Like you can do it yourself and get it out there really quickly. And I think that actually sometimes having the space to really edit and get to grips with your collection before releasing it is important. So the problem with self-publishing is that you have to almost self-impose that time. And sometimes poetry collections can go out before they're ready. So worth thinking about there. How do you promote your work? There are sort of two-pronged attacks. Or at least there's two branches, and then off of those two branches are more branches. And so one of them is through online and one of them is through performance. Taking your poetry collection and getting gigs, getting sets, book sets, or even, you know, just open mic nights and reading them to people and saying on stage, "I'm going to read this poem. It's from my collection. I have some copies if anyone wants to buy them." That has sold just as many books for me as online. Like it's basically equal at this point. So that's one way. And then online, you know, I have created a whole series of videos about how to publish your poetry collection and talking about my book all the way through that. I have, you know, built a YouTube channel full of information on how to write poems and all things poetry and book nerdery. And in the description of these videos, you can find a link to my poetry collection. I also have built up social media channels, and I've, you know, built my website. I've got my online shop. One of the most recent things I have done to promote my work is the answer for Wordle on Friday was grief. And so I whipped up a quick social media graphic and said, you can use today's Wordle answer for 10% off. And I set it up as a discount code on my website. And it actually worked. It actually worked, which was cool. So actually, after I finished filming, I'm going to go and post 3 of my books out to people. So yeah, that worked, which is nice. The next question I have here is, when is book 2 due? And I just want to say, slow down, honey bun. I already know what book 2 is going to be. I have a whole collection of, collection is weird. I probably have a pamphlet's worth of poems that are ready to go, but there is also more to write. Like, I have the ideas for several poems. I've got like a rough structure in my head. So I still need to write those. And right now, over the next couple of months at least, I'm going to be focusing on this book, the book I've just released, and sharing that with the world. I will be sort of writing a little bit, but I'm not, my emphasis isn't going to be on the writing so much. Having said that, yeah, I think it's going to be at least a couple of years out, like 2025, 2026 maybe. So keep an eye out. Why not? Let's go. Please explain the cover process and art. It is also interesting, particularly since yours is quite surreal. I'm really glad I got a question about this. I have actually made a whole video with my illustrator about the process of it. And one of the additional questions I got was like, do the individual items have significance? So that's what I'm going to do, right? And I'm going to talk you through some of the little Easter eggs that are on the cover. But if you want to know more about like the whole process and how I found my illustrator and how we worked together, then go and watch that video. We go into a bit more detail there. So my illustrator is a digital collager. They use digital collage in their art. So this is actually made up of like actual photographs that are stuck together in different ways. We have a kitchen like scene. Like someone ripped a kitchen out of a house and put it on a beach, and it's sort of crumbling and falling apart. One of the central images here is the kitchen sink, which is on fire. And this is related to one of the last lines in the collection, which is a barbecue perfectly built in a kitchen sink, which I liked because it sort of has this idea of fire and flame and violence in a domestic setting of a kitchen sink. But I also liked it because my family have literally used old tin kitchen sinks as barbecues. And in fact, the photo of the sink here is one of my family photos. The flames are not, the flames are added on, but that is the photo of the barbecue that was a kitchen sink, and that's there. Another thing I want to tell you is that the surfer in the background here is my dad. That is a photo of my dad that my illustrator used. And the family photos on the wall of the kitchen here are family photos. This yellow is almost the same yellow as what my family's kitchen was when I was growing up. And there's a kebab in the oven being warmed up, which is another line in the last poem of the collection is called Father as Many Things, which is like a series of images that like all metaphors about my dad. And yeah, the kebab is featured on there. And also I like the fact that the artwork wraps around the book, so it's actually like one big picture like this. And there's sort of like litter and rubbish on the beach. To be clear, I do not condone littering on the beach, but those items are like cans of beer and whiskey bottles and ashtrays and stuff like that. So yeah, those are a few little Easter eggs, but if you want to know more about the whole process, I will link to the video. I'll make it pop up here or something. So those are all the questions I had about my book. I hope you enjoyed this video. I just want to take a moment to say a huge thank you to everyone who was involved in helping this book become a reality. This is the sort of final video about my series on how to get published. So if you haven't watched any of those, go watch them. It'll give you an insight into my publishing journey, and I fill it full of advice for people who are looking to publish their first collections as well. So go and check those out. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. You can support the channel by buying my book. The link is in the description. You can also join me on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Links down there. You can follow me on social media. I am at Josie Alford Poet. If you want to support me without spending any money, follow me on social media, like this video, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, share it, because all of that like engagement online will help small creators like me get found, and that is really helpful. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.